along the ferny corridor. I never do know what they think. Possibly about sunspots, or the blind Celtic fish. My man is the 18th European authority on the chemistry of the ancients, said George. He writes monographs about it, and sells my things to pay for having them printed. Of course that isn't true. They laughed together as they entered the supper room, a vast chamber of the dimensions of a banqueting hall. No, I'm afraid it's only conversation, George admitted, while secretly admiring the curves of her throat. But all the true things have been said so often. She looked at him oddly. I wonder whether they have. Some things are true enough, but... She screwed her lips into a grotesque smile, and they sat down at the table in such an offhand way that George felt that he must have supped with her before in his dreams. The meal, though cold, was admirable, and the wines fit for an undergraduate in the first flush of his credit. But there was no sign of the servants, who might wonder, what? This is an adventure, George said to himself cheerfully, and then aloud, I don't know about that, I'm sure. He wished that he knew her Christian name. I myself am to some extent a student of the extraordinary, and if I may say so, I have seen some unusual things and been in some out-of-the-way places. But really, the possibility is soon exhausted, and miracles are rare. 99 out of every 100 of my adventures are mere perversions of the obvious. In tabulating them, I have divided them into 10 groups. And how many of the commandments have you broken? She asked, smiling queerly. All but one, I'm afraid, said George, wondering a little at her quickness. She laughed aloud. Why, that's what you told my husband, she said. You were not up to date. Here was something to puzzle about, thought George. This pretty problem had a husband, and he had told him. And what in the thunder did she mean by her last remark? By the way, where is your husband now? He said casually. In itself, this does not appear a very humorous question, but it certainly had a remarkable effect on the lady. Some people would call you grim, she murmured between her shrill ripples of laughter. Perhaps you'd like to have him down to sup with us. He's upstairs, you know. Well, I don't mind, you know, said George, feeling his way towards an explanation, so long as I do not lose the pleasure of supping with you. The lady looked at him with bright lights of excitement in her eyes. It would be a thrill, wouldn't it? She said, rising. If you'll help me to carry him. So her husband was an invalid, a madman, or a pitcher. I hope it isn't leprosy, George thought to himself. There's something about this woman. But he dutifully followed her upstairs. She stopped outside a door on the first floor, with her hand on the handle. Shall I knock? She said flippantly. George nodded, and her little knuckles set a playful echo trotting lightly down the passage, like a child released from lessons. Then she opened the door and beckoned him in. 30 seconds later, he reeled out of the room into the corridor with a white face and his body shaking. Good God! What have you done? He cried. The woman who had followed him was hardly less disturbed. Don't say you've got a conscience. Don't say you've repented. You've been splendid up to now. He glared at her fiercely. What do you mean? He stammered. She stood looking at him in obvious amazement. It's not possible, she muttered to herself, frowning. Then she caught him by the arm and led him up to a mirror which was set upright in the wall. Look, she said, watching him. On the white front of his shirt, just below his tie, George saw the imprint of 4 red fingers, and as he looked, he wavered and sickened, and thought of the dead thing in the room beyond him. I thought it so bizarre of you to change everything but that, said the woman, in the tone of one who is disappointed. George pulled himself up and turned his eyes on her pitifully. What am I to do? He cried. I should think we had better finish our supper.